to the Oxygenaddict Triathlon Podcast. We're brought to you every week by our sponsors, PrecisionHydration.com, electrolytes in different strengths that match how you sweat. You can get 15% off your first order with the code Oxygenaddict15. And there's also a link in the show notes. You can book a free hydration call with their experts. And if you mention you heard of that via our show, you're entered to win a £50 Precision Hydration bundle. Okay, guys, welcome to this week's show. A lot of you will have seen from the title already. I've decided to do a rerun this week of an interview from earlier in the year. Every year I like to do a couple of reruns over the Christmas period, essentially so that I can take a bit of a break from doing the show. I'll be completely honest with you. I need a little bit of downtime to recharge my batteries. So I went back through the best shows of the year, and it's been a great year. There's been tons and tons and tons of great interviews to choose from. And rather than choose ones with interviews, choose interviews with athletes, I decided to choose a show this week that's really going to help you out as athletes. And again, the show I've chosen for next week as well, I'll come to that next week, but chosen to help you out with your training and to help you out with, getting you into the best shape you can possibly be for next year. This week's episode is a rerun of the heart rate variability episode I did interviewing Dr. Marco Altini. Now, if you've listened to this before, I'd highly recommend you listen to this one again. It was one of our most downloaded episodes this year anyway, but it's worth going back to it because since we ran this interview, it was back in, episode 285. I guess it was sometime in early May we ran this. We pivoted almost entirely to having all of our training plans, all of our coaching, all of our athletes entirely led by HRV, heart rate variability. Getting Marco on the show was a reaction. We'd done tons of reading around it before this. We'd spoken to lots of different experts, and Marco was the perfect confluence of someone who really, really understood the science and someone who'd created an app that made the science really simple. HRV's been around for probably the best part of a decade in various forms, but it had been very complicated to use. And in the pre-interview, before we did this interview, it became obvious that Marco was the guy worldwide who had, he's got that very clever synergy of being able to understand a very complex subject, but make it simple enough that it's really, really useful, but not so simple that it's useless. There are other options out there for measuring HRV. Not all of them are as useful and as good and as accurate as this one. Some of them, obviously with something as simple as this and as important as this, if it doesn't work, it's worse than having no data at all. And Marco will talk about this during his interview. So Marco is the guy who created an app called the HRV4Training App. And like I said, we've pivoted with our team Oxygenaddict athletes. All of our plans this year have been HRV led. We encourage all of our athletes, and probably 90% of them do this, have downloaded the app. They use the app every day. They take their HRV for 1 minute first thing in the morning, and the HRV reading determines whether or not they're going to complete that day's planned training as it was written. And in a sense, the HRV is the missing piece of the puzzle that allows you to make sure that the training you do on a given day is actually the most effective training that you are capable of doing on that day. And as Marco will go into during his interview, if your body isn't capable of absorbing the hard training in this day, it's completely pointless you doing a hard training session. You're just going to make yourself more tired. And conversely, if you avoid doing hard training on the days when your HRV drops, showing that your body just isn't in a receptive state to be able to absorb hard training, you actually make more progress over a given period of time than somebody who trains hard anyway. So it's a fascinating subject. We've had tons of feedback over the past 7-8 months from athletes. Not all of it positive initially. I'm going to be completely honest with you because it's a stretch at first to accept. HRV often doesn't line up with what you're expecting it to say, and it often doesn't line up with how you feel. It's almost like an early warning system. So it's really common for our athletes to say, look, I got a flag of an amber flag or a red flag on HRV that says I should either reduce the intensity or I should rest today, but I feel fine. What do you think I should do? And our answer is always follow the guidance that you've been given by the app, because it's responding to these almost microscopic changes in your heart rate variability that are an early warning system as to whether or not you are ready and able to absorb the stress that day. And of course, as we've always known or always suspected, the stress that affects your ability of your body to absorb the training or not isn't just training stress. So yes, in a professional athlete who just trains and recovers all day, most of the stress in their life is going to be caused by the training stress they put on themselves. But most of us working age groupers, predominantly the amount of stress we're under is down to job stress, life stress, work stress, whether we slept well, stress in our family lives. And obviously living through the times of COVID as we are at the moment, that is massively, massively up in the air and really important. So if you haven't downloaded this app yet, it is 10 quid. It's not free. So I'd encourage you, we're not sponsored by Marco. We're not on any kind of affiliation with him. There's nothing in it for me, except to say, I think it's been the most important and game-changing thing that we've done with our athletes and the athletes I coach this year. I would really encourage you to download the app, start using it every day. Give it a really solid go for 30 days, 45 days, and see the difference it makes to your training, because almost all, I'd say 99% of the athletes who followed the guidance here feel that they've made more consistent progress over the time they've used it because they've been forced to rest and recover early and, are reporting much less incidents of those essentially forced to stop training because you've overtrained yourself into the ground, essentially. So yeah, it's really, really interesting app. It's a great interview with Marco. Yes, I'll let the interview run, and then I'll do a little just before Christmas wrap up at the end of this interview. So, as I've already mentioned, our interview is sponsored by Precision Hydration. You can get 15% off your first order with the code Oxygenaddict15 at the precisionhydration.com website. With that, over to today's interview with Dr. Marco Altini. Marco, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm really excited to have you on because HRV is one of the hot topics at the moment. It's something that isn't easily understood by most of us. And I think the concept of it is something that we all buy into and think, wow, that's great. There's a magic number that'll tell me whether I'm recovered or rested or not. But when you actually get into using it, things are a little bit more complicated than that. So anyway, first up, look, thank you for joining us. How are things with you? You're in Amsterdam at the moment, right?
Yeah, correct. Thank you for having me. And I hope I will be able to shed some light on HRV and how to use it effectively.
I'm sure you will be able to, because I'm starting from a baseline of pretty much zero. So tell us a bit about your background then. You're the guy who originated and developed the HRV4Training App. And anyway, having used that for close to 6 months myself, I think you've done a really good job of turning the really complicated numbers that, the sort of RMSS squared type tiny chunks of time, or what the hell does that mean, into a number that actually makes sense to a human brain. So start off, tell us about your background and how you came around to developing this app.
Yeah, so I have a technical background with degrees in engineering and computer science and a PhD in data science, but all my work was always applied to, let's say, interpreting physiological data collected using wearable sensors. And this started 10, 12 years ago when we had, just some prototypes of sensors that you could put on your body to measure, cardiac activity and things that were not so user-friendly, but still the data was what triggered my interest. You can process this data to understand something more about the body in terms of fitness, in terms of stress, all these parameters. And then, with technology getting better and phones getting better and the smartphones coming up, Bluetooth technology becoming, easier to interact with, I started working on technology that people could actually use, for example, using an app, so that we would not just do research with these platforms, but we could actually develop something, that you put out there and people use to collect data and learn, how different stressors impact them, how you respond to different training. And that's basically what motivated, HRV4Training. And in particular, at that point, I've developed this technique to measure heart rate variability using the phone cameras. So, something that at that point does not even require a sensor, which makes it, much easier, especially when it's something you have to do first thing in the morning, and you don't want to, wear a strap and go to the restroom and, wet the strap and do all that process. And it always feels way too cold, right?
Yeah, totally. Nobody
Exactly.
wants to put a chest strap on first thing in the morning today.
Exactly. So that's how it started a few years back. And then, we continued from there, validated the camera-based measurements as something that is as good as an ECG or a strap, and then started working on, the analytics on top of that. And as my interest went more into sports science, then I've done also another master's in human movement sciences and high-performance coaching, which I'm finishing this year here in Amsterdam. So that's a bit my background, yeah.
Okay, cool. So there's a lot to dig into there. Let's kick off firstly then. At its most basic level, what is HRV? How would you describe it to athletes, and why is it important to them?
Yeah, so HRV, basically refers to a way to compute the difference between heartbeats. Let's talk about why that's important. So basically, this is the most effective and non-invasive method that we have to capture stress. And this is simple because, the autonomic nervous system and, how your body responds to stressors is something that regulates heart rhythm. So, the autonomic nervous system responds to stress, and it changes your heart rhythm in response to these stressors. And that's what we measure, your heart rhythm. So by doing that, you understand how your body responds to various stressors. And that's, I would say, a bit of the basic principle here. As your body doesn't really know if, your stressor comes from training or from some other stressor, which might be, due to lifestyle or some psychological stressors. All stressors affect the autonomic nervous system in a similar way from this point of view.
Yeah.
And that's why, these metrics then become relevant because you capture this overall marker of stress.
Okay, so I'm going to give you my basic understanding of this, and I want you to tell me whether I'm right on it. So our heart doesn't beat in a regular rhythm. There's tiny variations between each time it beats. And now let me get this right. The more stress you're under, the more regular your heartbeat gets.
Perfect.
Is that right? So what your clever little app does is it measures the variability between each heart rate, and that's a really accurate measure of how much stress you're under.
Correct.
Okay. And so, when I started looking into this, firstly, I remember looking into it about 4 or 5 years ago originally with another coach who was really into it, and I just couldn't understand the data, the measurements and the tiny, you're talking like 0.0001 of a second in the variation. And I was looking at it thinking, firstly, I'm too stupid to understand this. And secondly, it just looks too complicated to have any sort of meaningful impact on day-to-day life. And I almost kind of put it on the shelf and went, I'll think about that later. And then luckily you've come along and you've turned it from what looks like a very complicated science into something that my very slow little brain can understand. And instead of getting a readout from the app that says, this is how variable your heart rate is, you just get a number out of 10. And so I wake up in the morning, I get my phone, I stick my finger on the back of the phone on the camera, and that's all it takes. It's 1 minute of having my finger over the back of the camera phone, and it gives me a number out of 10 with a decimal place, where a higher number is less stressed, more recovered, more ready to train, and a lower number is the opposite of that. And it gives me a real good reading as to whether or not basically I'm ready to go, I'm ready to train, I'm ready to train hard or long every day. Is that about the right sort of layman's terms?
Yeah, exactly. I think, there are different points here we can talk about. I think we made a lot of progress in terms of, days of use of the technology. So obviously, in the older days, maybe you had to go to the lab, or you had to use, some equipment that took like several minutes to take a measurement and things like that, and then would give you, a series of HRV numbers. That's also something that is always misunderstood because, HRV is, let's say, this variability between beats, but then you can quantify it in many different ways, right? You can get a whole bunch of what we call features, or basically just numbers that represent your HRV. And I think in the past, 5 to 10 years, the sports science community kind of settled on one of these, which is a clear marker of parasympathetic activity. So, again, of a branch of the nervous system, which is the one that represents better recovery and rest. And that's why, a higher value is associated to a more rested state, or a state in which, in theory, you're, ready to perform, because a higher value means more parasympathetic activity in this case. So it starts from there, from the fact that finally we decided that, okay, this is the feature we're going to use, and this is how we represent HRV. And I think at this point, many different products start from there, which is good, because, we don't all use some sort of different metrics as it was done in the past, or it is often done in research, but things are way more consistent. Yeah. And then, we start from that number, and we just make it a bit more user-friendly, but it's just a transformation that allows you indeed to get something in the decimal scale, because we are human beings and we like that. So it makes it much easier. Yeah. So, and that's a starting point. And then the other point that is important is how you use this number, right? Even just on a day-to-day basis, how do you interpret it? Because again, in the older days, maybe we just could not measure every day, right? We would measure maybe before a training camp, or 3 times during the season. And I think that's not really an effective way of using these metrics, because this is not a VO2 max test or a lactate threshold test, something that you do to track progress. This is really something you use to track stress continuously as a sort of feedback. You want to act on this feedback continuously, and then what you optimize in the long term is not HRV itself, but its performance. So by using these tools daily, now you get a much better idea of, what are your daily scores this week, how much these scores change specifically for you. And that way it's easy when you have a score that is particularly low for you to understand that there is just more stress in this moment for you. And then you can make changes, to adjust for that additional stress.
Yeah. And that was something that I think I've learned over time as we've been looking at groups of our athletes who are using it. Originally, first, well done on coming up with a decimal scale out of 10, because it makes it so easy to understand. If you've got a score of 9.8 and 9.7 and 9.8, and then the next day it's 7.3, my brain can look at that and just go, oh, well, that's obvious then, in a way, whereas in previous versions of looking at HRV, it just wasn't as obvious, was it? And I think your app does a great job of, especially if an athlete, we can get them to measure it daily, every day, you can get a really nice track across time, and it becomes really obvious where their individual normal everyday range is and where one of their big drops happens. Yeah. And I think that's something that took me a while to get my head around, that it's kind of different for everybody, and everybody has a normal level of their variability between an upper and a lower range. And then when it drops really low, it becomes quite obvious it's outside of the normal range. Whereas again, initially looking at it day by day, it can be quite hard to sort of see the picture from above, can't it? But the athletes we've had who've used it they found it really, really useful firstly as a backup. It's very often been a kind of, do you know what? I woke up this morning, I'd had a terrible day yesterday at work. I was really stressed out. I felt really crappy this morning. And when I took my HRV, it had dropped by 2.5 points. So I decided to do an easy training session rather than a hard one. And it's almost like it's a quantifiable piece of science that gives them permission to back up what they already know, which is, I'm not up to a hard training session today.
Yeah, exactly. I think, the fact that you can get some objective feedback, I think it can be useful on, at various levels, especially I think in the context of being just a bit more aware about stress, and indeed understanding when it's time to slow down a bit. At the same time, it can be useful, when working with athletes, as, just something you can use to start a conversation, around what is going on, right? Because maybe you have a plan and everything is going well, and then at a certain point you start seeing values that drop, particularly showing that there is stress. And, as a coach, you might not know everything that is going on in the athlete's life, but, then you have something that you can use, to try to dig a bit deeper and see what is happening, and then use that information.
Yeah. Okay, so one really interesting thing that came out of this for me was initially I started looking at it as a kind of, great, HRV is going to tell me the days that my athlete is not up to a hard training session, and we can kind of swap the hard session out for an easier one and perhaps move it to later in the week when they're feeling better and the HRV's recovered, or maybe not replace it. And that's great. I think that's a very sound principle. But the other thing that's been really noticeable with this is I assumed that training was going to be the major thing that was going to affect HRV, and almost would be looking at it and it's like, sleep and stress and family arguments, they all play a part, but it's how hammered they are with training that's the most important thing to how they respond to training. But it looks from the HRV readings that actually all stress is stress, and work stress, life stress can have just as much an impact on an athlete's ability to do a hard session as training stress can.
Yes, certainly. And, if you think especially about, good athletes, or athletes that are really used to training daily and to sustain decent volumes of training, at that point, the training stressor is not even the bigger stressor. When everything is going fine, you expect their physiology to be perfectly normal, even if you do, a hard block of weeks of hard training. Still, if that's what you do because, it's your job, or simply because you are used to it and you've done it for many years, you want, things to be in your normal. You expect physiology to be normal. You don't expect necessarily any drops in your HRV. But then when other stressors come in and, they have a role in, in what's your capacity also to handle additional stress. And then you could see drops there. And then, that's something that is typically a warning, because again, our capacity to handle stress is limited. So if you put the typical high volume, high intensity training of, good athletes together with all other stressors, then you get in a situation in which, again, your parasympathetic system is impaired. And you are also at higher risk of, all sorts of issues from, just burnout to overtraining to injury, because, you're just, your body is not handling stress well anymore at that point, which is, again, why these markers of stress are useful, because you capture really the full picture and not just training related stress, because, otherwise you already have TSS or everything that you need, right, to quantify training. I think that's where it comes in, is that you put it together with these other metrics and to see how, an individual responds to that.
Yeah. Now, one thing that I found really interesting when we talked before, you mentioned a study where two groups of athletes were compared. Do you remember telling me about this, where one was entirely led by HRV? Will you talk us through that study? Because I think the athletes listening to this will find that fascinating.
Yeah, exactly. So there's two separate studies, one in out of Finland and one in Spain, one in runners and one in cyclists, in which both of them, in both of the studies, the goal was to test HRV guided training in the context of performance. So these two groups, one group would follow regular periodization. So in any case, they would have a plan consisting of some hard sessions and some easy sessions, as we all know. And the other group would actually have the same plan, but would make adjustments based on their HRV. And in particular, when their baseline HRV was outside of what's their normal values, as you talked before, like this sort of band of, where your physiology is expected to be on a day-to-day basis based on your historical data. If when your baseline is outside of this, for example, it could be that, for a couple of days you had very low scores and there is a lot of stress on your body. And it might not be an ideal moment to put, a lot of intensity in a workout. So that's exactly what they did. So in this case, when the baseline was outside of normal, they would just scale down the intensity. So if they had a hard session, they would say, okay, let's just do a moderate session. If they had a moderate session, they would do an easy session. So that's what they did basically in both studies. And the interesting bit is that, at the end of the study, obviously the group that was HRV guided had a few less, intense sessions because sometimes they had to skip it. They still did it a few times, but, when physiology was not optimal, they skipped it. And yet, both groups, in the cyclists and the runners, the HRV guided had better performance at the end of the study. So I think this is, a good insight because it tells you that it matters when you go to apply a certain stimulus, and it's not just the plan, but also when your body is ready to take, that kind of stimulus and adapt to that in a way that is positive in the longer term in the context of performance.
Yeah, and I think that the jumps from memory, it was something like the running group had a 5% increase in their performance, and the cycling group, and that was over, the cycling group had a 40-minute time trial, didn't they? And it was a 7% improvement, even though technically they'd done less hard training along the way in the block. They were 7% better than the group who had trained just according to the plan, regardless of whether their HRV dropped, didn't show any improvements. It's almost like that idea of just get the training done no matter what. Who knew? That isn't the right way. Who knew? Listen to your body. Exactly. And I find that really, really interesting. Now, you mentioned there that they skip the intensity. A lot of our listeners are long distance triathletes, 70.3 and iron distance. What sort of guidance can we see around duration of training? Is it a similar thing? If I'm thinking, for example, a really busy professional who's traveled a lot during the week, has worked a lot, has been up late, has missed sleep. They've got the 5.5 hour ride scheduled at the weekend, and they get up and they're absolutely shattered and the HRV's dropped. What would the guidance be there in terms of duration of the training?
Yes, so I think in general, really what we've seen in most of the studies is about intensity. So, you just don't want to give that hard stimulus. But I've not seen, research looking into volume particularly in this. My guess would be that, normally what I do even personally, or what I tell people to do in this case, is really just to keep the intensity low, maybe even lower than what's, your typical aerobic long session that you would do. Because, your body is already stressed and probably tired. But that kind of session, I would still do it and just, scale down a bit the intensity if you have your heart rate or power zones, whatever you think it's useful for you to do in, a zone 2, maybe you do it a bit less, just because you don't want to, still at the same time, that your body is telling you that there is a lot of stress, so you don't want to overdo it. But I think that would be a good way to do it. And at the same time, there is always the daily score and, the baseline, these two aspects that we touched on briefly. And, when you look at the baseline, it simply means that you look at your average of the week instead of just the score today. And looking at the baseline normally is, a bit more informative because you capture, of course, a trend in stress, which is a bit, longer term and a bit more the big picture of what is happening in your body. So it could be that you just have a low day today because of, a number of reasons, and this is not going to impact your training. But if your baseline is going down, and, that means that there is several days in which stress has been significant. And then for sure, I would say it makes a lot of sense to try to scale down intensity and take it easy a couple of days to avoid, just longer recoveries.
Yeah, nice. So let's talk about your app a little bit then, because the way it looks on the screen, we'll take our HRV first thing in the morning. And like I said, it's dead simple. You just put your finger over the back of the camera, you lie still for a minute and job's done. And then on the screen, it gives you today's score, it gives you yesterday's score, and it gives you the baseline score, which is your rolling average over the last 7 days. And so the three of those numbers together form a really good picture for what's happening right now and what's happening as a trend over the last 7 days. And it sounds like that's what's important, the long-term trend, as much as the day-to-day drop.
Yeah, exactly. So the first thing is really the most important probably when you start is just to do it right in terms of the morning routine, because again, anything affects your physiology. So you don't want to, take your measurement after you had coffee or even after, you read your email or your social media, something upset you and,
Yeah.
probably you can feel it that, you get all red and your, blood flow and everything. And it's like, that's not a good moment to measure, right? But so, take it easy, your morning routine, you wake up, ideally you're still lying in bed, relaxed, take the phone, take the measurement. It lasts 1 minute. It's pretty easy, just breathe naturally. And that's how you start collecting data, which is, a protocol that is based on what was done in research in the lab, when you had people coming in and then, rest like half an hour because, they were coming from home and driving or biking and it was all sort of confounding factors. But it's actually much more reliable now that you can do it at home because you avoid all of that.
Yeah.
Just make sure to do it, at the right time, every day consistently. And then you start accumulating, your scores and see how things are trending. It's going to take a few days before you get anything useful out of it. Again, because there is nothing to do with absolute values here, comparing your score with your friends, like it's something that gives you no insights because everybody is different and you just want to look at how stress is changing over time for yourself in relation to, all the stressors that are present in your life. So training, lifestyle, anything that is affecting you, you will capture it that way. And again, as you said, you see the daily score, you see yesterday's scores and the baseline. So 7 days moving average of how things are trending for you. And once you have even more data, then we start building what we call these normal values, which is basically 2 months of your prior data, which is used to understand what's a normal day-to-day score for you. And, when your daily score is outside of this normal, the app will tell you. And for example, we'll highlight that there is more stress today and it might be a good idea to, again, lower intensity or do something that gives priority to, recovery.
Okay. The other thing that's interesting is you collect a lot of subjective data as well, straight after taking the measurements. Talk to us a little bit about the other things that you ask questions about and why that's important in the same context of how ready to train we are.
Yeah, exactly. So, as you said, we are always looking for this, number that tells us everything about what we need to do, right? About training and everything else. And there is no such a thing, right? HRV is a useful marker of stress, but you have to combine it with other things. And the two, I would say, most important things for an athlete would be, subjectively how you feel and your training load. So that's what is captured in the app. Right after the measurement, there is a short questionnaire where you enter information about, your sleep quality, your motivation to train, your muscle soreness, things that are relevant but not directly captured by the measurement. At the same time, there is, you can pull information about training from Strava or Training Peaks so that you get also that information, and then you will be able to have, basically what we call context around your measurements. So you don't have just your data points, which are, hardly interpretable, especially after a few weeks or months. You don't remember exactly what was happening those days. But then, with all the context around it and, your subjective data and, information about when you traveled or when you were sick, when you raced, all of that will help you making sense also retrospectively of the data you collected and potentially make changes for the next time.
Yeah, okay, that's really interesting. So the idea of, asking people, were you stressed yesterday? Have you traveled a lot? Are you sore this morning? What strikes me about this app is, although it started grounded in science, it's very much more in the art of capturing what else is going on in an athlete's life. And I really like it because often an athlete will come to me and say, this marker of, you said before, TSS is up or my FTP's improved. A scientific number will kind of validate in an athlete's mind that training is working. But the coaching part of the relationship is often finding out what's going on in the job, in the family, what's creating stress, have they slept well, and trying to give context to an athlete and almost, I don't want to even say give permission to the athlete to have an easy day. Sometimes it's as hard as saying to the athlete, I want you to have an easier day today for these reasons. And often the type A personality will reply with, yeah, but I don't want to do that. I want to go hard. I'm willing to do the training. I want to break 10 hours at Ironman Austria. I should be going hard today. And the thing I love about your system is I kind of feel I've now got a scientific sidekick saying to me, no, like the science says you'll actually be faster in 10 weeks time if you go a bit easier today than if you push on really hard today when the numbers don't say that you should be doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, it's sometimes it's difficult just to quantify these aspects, right? Especially as you say, type A personality, and, you want to always go hard, but we all know that then it never ends well, right? That we have all the stories about, overtraining and burnout of athletes and, CEOs that were, on top of their game, and then something happened. So I think what this information can do to start with is just provide a little more awareness, understand a bit better if there is more stress or not for you, and, how that affects you, and then indeed potentially make changes which can benefit you in the longer term.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot about how you can use your app with any smartphone to measure HRV. There's a couple of other options out there that people are given. I've got an athlete who uses a Whoop strap, which pretty much tracks heart rate the whole time. I know a lot of athletes are using Garmin's, and Garmin have got a kind of, although they don't call it HRV, they do a kind of rest and recovery score type thing. What are the drawbacks and positives of those other systems that people might have access to straight away? Is it a case that sort of bad data is worse than no data?
Yeah, I would think so. I would say that, it's HRV is something that is easy to mess up. That's why also there is so much confusion around it, and also why it took like 50 years for this to find some adoption, right? Because it's nothing new, right? We did not invent anything. It's all based on things we knew already a long time ago. But it's just a bit easier to do. But at the same time, it's still easy to mess it up. As I was saying before, you have to do the measurement first thing in the morning. The other valid option is to do it during the night. So, you mentioned the Whoop. There is also the Oura Ring. These devices that measure during the night, I would consider them valid devices because, that's a good time to capture this baseline physiological stress that we are interested in. Same thing as the morning measurement that you can do with our app or with other apps like the Elite HRV app, for example, which you pair to a sensor like a chest strap, or they have also a finger sensor that you can use. Those are all good methods. In terms of wrist-based devices, which you can pair to an app, there are more limitations. I think the only sensor I found that was as good as a chest strap was this Scotch Rhythm 24, which is used also for working out. You place it on the arm, and that's about it. Some other devices, I think they might also be doing it right, but they're not maybe very transparent about what is happening or when it is measured or when it is what is it compared to with, is it compared to your data now compared to your night of data, or is it your data now compared to your previous day's data? Like sometimes you just don't know what is happening there, and then I think it's a bit difficult to use that information to adjusting or guide training. For example, I'm not sure how it is working in the Garmin devices, even though I know that they have a few features linked to this. Also this new sort of battery level, I think they call it, like body battery sort of feature related to stress. So, I'm sure there is some solid science behind that, but sometimes it's a bit difficult to understand exactly how it is computed, and then I would not generally advise to rely on something that we don't know exactly how it's working, just because then you're a bit blind to whatever they're doing, and then they send an update and it's different because the feature always changes, and then you don't know what you're doing anymore. So just try to use something that exactly what it's doing, or you can ask the company and they can explain it to you. But in general, I think the most important thing about the measurement is really just to do something that can do it either in the night or first thing in the morning, and that has been validated, to be an accurate measurement of HRV.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. All right. So your app, the Elite HRV one, which needs like a finger sensor, the Whoop, the Aura Ring, because of the consistency in when it's collected, you can be sure that there's a consistency in collecting your baseline. But if you're not sure about that, then it kind of makes the data a bit less reliable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think all of these devices also, they report this RMSSD value, which we use to compute our score, and, the other companies use to compute their score or just to show it as it is. So it's also nice because, it all starts from the same marker of stress. So you can do things consistently, even if you at a certain point decide, to change product for a reason or the other.
Yeah. Okay. So moving away from training a little bit, then I came into this looking for almost for a magic bullet that would allow me to say, all right, this is how I'm going to adjust. I've written a training plan, I've sketched it out over the next 20 weeks, but we obviously have to adjust it on a day-by-day basis. And I was looking for that magic bullet that would say to me, okay, don't go hard on this day because it would be better off doing it on another day. And it sounds like HRV is really useful for that. But it also sounds like HRV measures stress in such a wide-ranging form across the entire spectrum of stress that your body might experience. Is it useful outside of training? If we were to take it outside the realm of athletics entirely, and we started talking about stressed out CEOs of companies who, end up going down with a heart attack at 55 because they don't have enough sleep, they have a poor diet. Is the HRV a really good measurement of sort of a holistic health almost in people like that?
Yeah, I would think so. Also, you can see, especially if you look at, longer term trends and, how things change over time for a person in relation to stress. Even in many cases with recreational or even decent athletes, you can see that, as you mentioned before, sometimes the largest factors are even not training related. So, you have other stresses in your life, things that worry you a lot, and you see that that sort of chronic stress develops over time and your HRV is lower and lower. And as a matter of fact, there is, this technology is used in so many different applications, as we have other apps that are like research versions, for example, that basically allow you to do the same simple measurement, but there is no training infrastructure around it and no interpretation. Is really for research studies. And, we collaborate with all sorts of scientists working on, psychological stressors, addictions, all sorts of factors that impact your physiology are relevant. The challenge there, I would say, from the point of view of the business, of having products that work in that space, is just that it's a bit more difficult to have the same kind of motivated individuals that would do this every day. Like the athletes from the recreational to the elite, they are really driven by their training and their objectives, and they want to improve, and they will wake up and take their measurements. It's a bit more difficult in other situations, or it could be just that it's more complex to have someone sticking to the routine and then capturing the data in a way that you have enough consistent measurements that you can actually use them to make useful adjustments. Because again, I think we've moved away by now from the older way of doing it, which was like isolated measurements far apart in time. Now you really want to do this daily so that you understand what's happening to your body in relation to various stressors and make adjustments, which again would work with in response to any sort of stressor, not only training.
Okay, and okay, so if we're accepting that HRV is a really good measure of the stress that we're under, can we reverse engineer it and sort of come up with a couple of things people can do to, like, what would be the biggest impact on somebody's body and HRV to get them back into optimal shape, ready to train, or just not to be under stress? Is it sleep? Is it diet? I mean, for example, what effect does a couple of good nights of extra sleep have on somebody's HRV?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. I think that's highly individual, but for sure sleep is one of the largest factors.
Okay.
And again, it doesn't mean that you have a poor night of sleep and then you cannot do anything, right? Again, there's people that can handle that very well. There's people that can even go a couple of nights with poor sleep and then still physiologically nothing bad happens, let's say. Or you can have people that just one poor night and their skull is very suppressed and it's already good time to try not to overdo it that day. So I think the data also gives you an insight on how a particular individual would respond. So that's a good starting point. And then, as you mentioned, diet and any other factor will have an impact there.
Okay. And does drinking alcohol have an immediate noticeable effect or day after effect on your HRV?
Yeah, for sure. That's probably one of the largest acute effects. When we talk about these acute stressors, it just means a stressor that, has an impact in the next 24, 48 hours.
Yeah.
And alcohol is one of the largest. Same as getting sick, those have like such a large effect on your physiology that it's one of the things that you can most easily capture when you do your daily measurements. And it makes you think a bit, wow, that's such a difference. It's like way worse than, those 3 weeks of high intensity training I did. So it makes you think a bit about it. Yeah. In terms of resting heart rate, even just, you don't even need to look at the HRV, but your resting heart rate is highly elevated by, I would say excessive alcohol consumption, but without going crazy. Doesn't mean if you have, a glass of wine or a beer, you might have zero impact on your baseline physiology. But if, there is one too many, I think that you can capture that quite easily.
Right. So one beer, one glass of wine, not really a big deal. 2 or 3 beers or glass of wine, big deal. It affects,
yeah, exactly.
right?
We had some data also from a user that shared this, that he analyzed his own data in response to this. A good athlete also, 2 hours and 25 marathon runner, and he's like 47, so, not bad.
Wow.
And he travels a lot for work. He's like also a very busy professional, and he put together this slide of when he has like maybe 2 or 3 glasses of wine instead of one. And you could see that the HRV is exactly the same when he has 1 glass, but there is a clear suppression in the other situations. So, it gives you also an insight on how you handle that.
Right. Wow. Okay. I don't think people are going to like listening to that answer, but I guess science is science.
Exactly. Just don't measure the January 1st, it's just the day you don't want to measure.
Yeah. So once an athlete's tracking their HRV regularly, what are the top couple of sort of simple, actionable things that they can do with the data to optimize their training on a day-to-day and a week-to-week basis?
So I think the first one is really this idea of scaling down intensity on days in which your scores are suppressed. But I wouldn't start just with that. When you start, I would really just look at the data. Understand how you respond as an individual to what you're doing. I think there is a first phase which I would call like sort of an awareness phase. And you learn a bit about how you handle the different stressors, training. Again, alcohol or whatever it is, traveling, if you have, someone that used to travel a lot before the world changed and things like that. So you look at all of these things and you see how your body responds and you learn something from that for sure. And then when you want to start implement changes, I would say the first thing is, to learn to scale down intensity a bit or to give priority to recovery in general, not just with training. When data is suppressed and there is a sign that there is more stress on the body, because that's probably not a good idea to add significantly more stress at that point, which again would just impair longer term recovery and performance.
Yeah. Okay. And so I guess the big takeaway here for me has been, I love that study you sent through that just showed, look, if we get 2 controlled groups, the only difference between them is one of them follows a rigid training plan and the other one simply reduces some of the hard work that they do on the days they're not ready for it. That group that does less improves more. Simply, that suggests that hammering your body on a day when it's not ready has a negative effect rather than just like a just like a no effect actually holds you back, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And if you ask me, like, even if you were not to see a performance improvement in this study and they would perform the same, still you've gained something because you did not do all that training that would actually lead to even no improvement with respect to not doing it, right? So it's just, you just put yourself at higher risk of, all sorts of things, from injury to overtraining, and then for no gain, just because we all know that, periodization and all of that, it's important to provide the right stimulus at the right time. But, the right time might also require to understand when your body is ready to stimulate that stimulus, regardless of, the fact that you scheduled 3 easy days in a row, right? It might be that still your body is not ready yet, and that's individual.
Yeah. And I suppose this is especially important at the moment, and at this time of pandemic, and everyone's trying to manage the life as best they can, and probably are under a lot more stress on a day-to-day basis. It can be very, it's a common story that I hear, that people kind of want to get the stress of their day out by going and training really hard. And there's this balancing act between, I feel better after I've done a hard session. Please, coach, don't make me just do an easy or a moderate session. I feel better after it. What can we learn from using HRV at the moment, particularly, do you think, to help people, either not get sick or just to manage the training through this period?
Yeah, I think that's very typical, and it's difficult. At the same time, I think it gives us again an insight on how also we are handling this situation. I've seen it also in our data here. We had weeks that particularly down, locked down inside, and you don't go anywhere. And it affects your physiology, and maybe it's a good idea then, to do your training but not go crazy about it. And you can also do your intensity, but again, maybe you do a bit less, less reps or shorter reps. You can do a lot of things still to get maybe that mental benefit, even without really, getting your body in trouble, let's say. And, as an overall marker of stress, I think this can help us also balancing things, especially as you pick up training again. Maybe now a few countries are opening up again. People can, even in Italy next week, people will be allowed, for example, to train outside again, not just within 100 meters of their home. So, a lot of people will go out and do crazy things. And it's probably a good idea then, to look at the data and see, now everything becomes again a novel stimulus that you're not used to, because it's going to be, again, higher volume and higher intensity with respect to the very low levels of these weeks. So, check how you respond, and, maybe take an extra day off between sessions and things like that. I think the tools can help you balance things a bit better.
Yeah. And I think that's a real danger that we don't necessarily consider so much here in the UK, because relatively our sort of, in inverted commas, lockdown has been so mellow compared to places like Spain and Italy, where people have literally not been allowed to go more than 100 meters from the house. I suppose the danger is in those countries, like you say, people are just going to be so pent up and ready to go. It'll be like the first day I'm allowed out the door, I'm riding 100 miles.
Yeah, most likely it's going to happen, and we will not be able to stop them with this podcast.
Yeah. Well, maybe that they start tracking HRV now, and then it gives us something extra to help moderate the danger to themselves aspect, as much as I just need to get outside and do something fun and crazy again.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that you get injured now that you can be outside, right? So you still want to take it easy.
We still want to train so we can train again tomorrow. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah. All right, so listen, let's wrap this up, Dad. Just giving you a bit of a plug for your app. Then tell us where it is and how easy it is to get hold of and where we can get it from.
All right, so you can find information on HRV4Training.com, and it's on the Apple Store and Google Play, so easy to find. Allows for the camera-based measurements, so normally you don't need anything else, any hardware. Provides a lot of insights on aerobic capacity and all sort of let's say training derived metrics that could also help you track progress with that, with respect to your physiology and your capacity to handle stress. And there is a lot of information on the website, short guides, blog posts, and we are also available, via email. If there is any questions or any doubts, we can try to help.
Awesome. Hey, well, listen, I just want to end by thanking you. I think what you've got here is you've got a really great product. The athletes that we've had a group of about 15 of them from the guys I coach, not sort of trialing it, but using it on a day-by-day basis and feeding back. And all of them have got something positive from it. All of them have found that there's days when it's guided them to back off on days when they otherwise would have pushed forward. And I think you've done a great job of turning it into something that's very complicated and turning it into something that makes sense certainly for my simple little brain, and gives us extra guidelines to help people train safer and to train in a more efficient way. So yeah, thanks very much, man. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Cheers, buddy.
Bye.
Okay, guys, I hope you got a lot from that interview. Tons and tons of information there. And I've been talking to a few guys and girls in the team that they wanted to go back and revisit this and just re-listen to it and think about the various things Marco's gone into there. It's really good to have the science reinforced to you, but I think what's more important is to have the sort of the studies that back this up and say, look, this is what we did. We did a double-blind study. It showed us this. You're actually going to make more progress over the medium and long term if you simply avoid training hard on the days when your body isn't ready to absorb the hard training. And guess what? You can't sense that. You can't feel it. It isn't something that you can work out. You have to track the HRV at that, almost, I want to say microscopic level. It's the wrong word. It's not the word I'm looking for. But, we're talking thousandths of a second here in terms of the variability between your heartbeats. So highly encourage you download this app. It's called HRV4Training. So the letters HRV and the number 4 and then training, all one word. It's available in both the Apple Store and the Google Play Store, priced at about a tenner. Treat yourself for Christmas. I think it'll be very interesting to watch the effect that Christmas has on all of us this year, to see the effects of the stresses of various things that go on in terms of our family life, our work life, family parties, stuff like that. An interesting one from the team has been feedback from people who drink and say, you know what, I was looking at my HRV and I had a few extra glasses of red wine last night, and it's amazing the effect it's had on me. Again, it's not going to be the same effect on everybody, but it's really made people reconsider the things that they do to set themselves up for the next day, which is not to say you shouldn't have a drink, but it's definitely to say if you're going to, you should know the effect it's going to have on you for the next day. And the HRV app is a great way to keep a track of that kind of stuff. All right, well, listen, I'll be back next week in the usual slot. I'm going to have another interview rerun for you then. But just to say to you, it's going to be Christmas Eve tomorrow as you hear this, if you're downloading it on the day it comes out. I wish you, your families, your loved ones a really safe and happy and enjoyable, fun Christmas. I hope you've had a fantastic 2020 despite everything. And here's to 2021. Here's to us all having a fantastic year coming up. So take care of yourselves. Take care of those people around you. Thanks again to our sponsors, precisionhydration.com. And yeah, until next week, I'm Coach Rob Wilby, and you've been listening to the Oxygenaddict Triathlon Podcast. Take care of yourselves. See ya.